They thought they were witnessing the end of an ordinary employee's career, but before the morning was over, every person in that hospital would question everything they believed about power, loyalty, and the woman they had been so eager to dismiss. The executive conference hall shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, polished marble reflecting rows of tailored suits, pressed white lab coats, and carefully rehearsed smiles as more than 200 doctors, nurses, administrators, and department heads filled every seat for what had been announced as a historic leadership meeting at St. Gabriel Medical Center. Cameras stood ready near the stage, waiting to capture another confident speech from Ethan Castellano, the celebrated CEO whose reputation for discipline and bold decisions had transformed the hospital into one of the most respected private medical centers in the country. Standing only a few feet behind the last row of executives was Naomi Carter, dressed in a simple navy housekeeping uniform, her dark curls neatly tied back, her employee badge hanging from a plain lanyard that drew no attention at all. She carried a clipboard against her chest, quietly reviewing maintenance notes that no one else had bothered to read. Around her, conversations lowered into whispers the moment she entered the room. Some exchanged knowing smiles. Others looked away with polite discomfort. A few openly smirked. Everyone knew she was Ethan Castellano's wife. Almost no one understood why. In their eyes, she never matched the elegant image expected beside a powerful executive. She rarely attended charity galas. She never appeared in magazine interviews. She preferred speaking with patients instead of investors, greeting janitors by name instead of wealthy donors, and spending lunch breaks comforting worried families in waiting rooms rather than joining exclusive executive meetings. To many people inside the hospital, humility looked suspiciously like weakness. Ethan adjusted his tailored charcoal jacket before stepping toward the podium, every movement measured, every expression carefully controlled. The room immediately fell silent. His calm voice carried across the auditorium with effortless authority. Leadership demands difficult decisions, he began. No organization succeeds when emotions interfere with accountability. Heads nodded throughout the audience. Board members folded their hands approvingly. Department directors exchanged confident glances, expecting another announcement about expansion, new research funding, or another award recognizing the hospital's remarkable growth. Instead, Ethan slowly turned toward the back of the room. His eyes settled on Naomi. "Mrs. Naomi Carter," he said, his voice colder than anyone expected. "Please come forward." Hundreds of faces turned at once. Naomi remained perfectly still for a brief moment before walking through the center aisle without lowering her eyes. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, each one accompanied by growing curiosity. She stopped several feet from the podium. Ethan never offered a greeting. Never acknowledged the years they had shared. Never softened his expression. Effective immediately, he announced, "Your employment with St. Gabriel Medical Center is terminated. Security will collect your identification before you leave the building." A ripple swept through the audience. Some gasped. Others exchanged satisfied smiles. One administrator quietly applauded before several more joined in, believing they were witnessing another example of uncompromising leadership. Naomi did not argue. She did not plead. She simply looked across the room, her eyes resting on familiar faces she had encouraged through sleepless overnight shifts, celebrated after successful surgeries, and comforted after heartbreaking losses. Several avoided meeting her gaze. Others looked almost relieved that someone else had become the morning's target. Near the front row, an elderly gentleman seated beside the hospital's legal counsel slowly removed his glasses. His weathered hands tightened around a leather folder resting in his lap. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't watching Ethan. He was watching Naomi with quiet sorrow, as though he already knew something the rest of the room had not yet begun to imagine. And while applause continued to echo beneath the chandeliers, not a single person realized they were celebrating the dismissal of the one woman whose signature alone determined who truly belonged inside those walls. 3 months earlier, before whispers replaced greetings and before silence became betrayal, Naomi Carter had walked through the employee entrance every morning at exactly 6:45 with the same quiet smile that most people never noticed. She parked her 10-year-old sedan in the farthest corner of the staff lot, carried her own lunch in a worn canvas bag, and greeted every security officer by name before stepping inside the hospital she had known since childhood. While executives arrived through a private entrance lined with polished stone and reserved parking spaces, Naomi preferred the hallway that smelled faintly of fresh coffee, disinfectant, and warm cinnamon rolls from the volunteer cafe. She believed that if someone wanted to understand a hospital, they should begin where patients first felt hope instead of where leaders delivered speeches. Every morning she paused at the pediatric wing to ask the overnight nurses how their shift had gone. She remembered birthdays, grandchildren, college graduations, and even favorite coffee orders. When a young resident looked overwhelmed after losing a patient despite every effort, Naomi never offered empty promises. She simply sat beside him for 5 quiet minutes until he found the strength to stand again. No cameras recorded those moments. No annual report ever mentioned them. To most people, she was simply another employee who seemed strangely comfortable walking through every department without asking permission. They assumed she was overly friendly. They never questioned why department managers listened whenever she casually suggested replacing outdated waiting room chairs or repairing a broken elevator before patients complained. Weeks later those changes somehow always happened, but the credit inevitably went elsewhere. Ethan Castellano rarely noticed. His calendar was filled with investors, expansion projects, and meetings celebrating rising revenue. Every newspaper praised his vision. Every magazine described him as the brilliant leader transforming modern healthcare. Naomi never argued with those headlines. She quietly clipped each article, placed them in a leather scrapbook, and smiled whenever Ethan reached another milestone. She genuinely wanted him to succeed because she believed success meant better care for every family who entered those doors. What she never told him was that her late father had once stood in the very same lobby holding blueprints rolled beneath his arm, dreaming of building a hospital where compassion would never become less valuable than profit. Before he passed away, he had repeated one lesson more often than any other. Buildings could be purchased. Equipment could be replaced. Even reputations could recover. But once people stopped treating one another with dignity, the heart of a hospital quietly disappeared long before anyone noticed. Naomi carried those words with her every day. She never displayed photographs of her parents in her office because she never used the executive office assigned to her years ago. Instead, she converted it into a family counseling room where relatives could receive difficult news in privacy instead of crowded hallways. Most employees assumed the unused office belonged to a retired administrator. None of them knew Naomi had surrendered it without hesitation. The only person who recognized the pattern was Arthur Bennett, the elderly chairman who had served beside Naomi's father decades earlier. More than once he watched from across the lobby as she comforted frightened children, thanked cafeteria workers, or helped environmental services staff collect supplies after long shifts. Every time he offered to publicly acknowledge her contributions, she answered with the same gentle smile. If they only respect kindness after they discover who owns the building, she once told him, then they never respected kindness at all. Arthur never forgot those words. As the months passed, however, he also noticed something else. Ethan had begun listening more closely to applause than to quiet wisdom, and inside a hospital built upon compassion, that subtle change was becoming far more dangerous than anyone realized. By the beginning of the 3rd month, success had changed the atmosphere inside St. Gabriel Medical Center in ways that most people celebrated without questioning. The lobby had become brighter, the donor wall longer, the financial reports stronger, and Ethan Castellano's confidence grew alongside every achievement. Investors praised his leadership. Healthcare magazines requested interviews. Business conferences invited him to speak about building a world-class institution. Every compliment reinforced the same quiet belief that had slowly taken root inside his mind. He was no longer simply leading the hospital. He believed he had become the reason it thrived. That belief spread through the executive offices faster than any official policy. Department directors began studying Ethan's expressions before offering opinions. Administrators repeated his favorite phrases during meetings. Managers stopped asking what was best for patients and started asking what would impress the chief executive officer. Somewhere along the way, genuine respect quietly transformed into calculated approval. Naomi noticed the change long before anyone else mentioned it. She could hear it in conversations that became polished instead of honest. She saw it in employees who hesitated before reporting problems because they feared appearing negative. She watched young nurses apologize for requesting additional equipment, even when they were advocating for patients who desperately needed it. Rather than criticizing anyone, Naomi simply continued doing what she had always done. She listened more carefully. She thanked people more often. She quietly arranged for broken wheelchairs to be replaced before complaints reached administration. She personally checked on elderly visitors who looked lost in unfamiliar hallways. She left handwritten notes of encouragement for exhausted overnight staff, never signing her name. Those simple gestures became quiet reminders that compassion still belonged inside the building, even if fewer people seemed to notice. Ethan rarely witnessed those moments anymore. His schedule had become a carefully organized chain of presentations, interviews, board meetings, and fundraising dinners. Whenever Naomi suggested spending more time walking through patient floors instead of conference rooms, he smiled politely but dismissed the idea. Leadership requires a broader perspective, he once replied while reviewing financial charts. Naomi answered with gentle sincerity. Sometimes the broadest perspective begins beside a single hospital bed. Ethan barely looked up from the documents. The conversation ended there, but several executives nearby exchanged amused smiles. Later that afternoon, one vice president quietly joked that Naomi still thought hospitals were run with kindness instead of strategy. Laughter circled the conference table. No one realized Arthur Bennett had overheard every word while passing outside the room. He paused only briefly before continuing down the hallway, disappointment heavier than anger settling across his face. The culture continued shifting in subtle ways. Employees who once greeted Naomi warmly now looked toward senior administrators before deciding whether to stop and speak. Invitations to planning meetings quietly disappeared from her calendar. When she offered thoughtful observations, someone else often repeated the same idea minutes later and received enthusiastic praise. Naomi never corrected anyone. She simply smiled and returned to helping wherever she was needed. To her, recognition had never been the purpose. Yet every unnoticed act of humility unintentionally magnified the growing arrogance surrounding those who chased recognition above all else. One rainy Thursday evening, after nearly everyone had gone home, Arthur found Naomi standing alone beside the large window overlooking the emergency entrance. Ambulances arrived one after another while nurses hurried through automatic doors with practiced determination. "Do you ever regret remaining invisible?" he asked softly. Naomi watched a volunteer carefully hold an umbrella over an elderly patient before answering. Invisible people often see the truth more clearly than those standing beneath the brightest lights. Arthur nodded without another word because he understood exactly what she meant. Neither of them realized that only weeks later the brightest lights in the hospital would illuminate a public decision built upon pride instead of wisdom, and every overlooked act of quiet dignity would suddenly become impossible for anyone to ignore. The applause faded almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt strangely heavier than any celebration. Naomi Carter stood exactly where Ethan Castellano had ordered her to stand, neither embarrassed nor defiant, simply composed in a way that unsettled those who expected tears, excuses, or anger. The human resources director approached with careful steps, holding a small envelope that contained the termination paperwork prepared before the meeting had even begun. Without making eye contact, she quietly asked for Naomi's employee identification badge. Naomi unclipped the badge from her uniform and placed it gently into the woman's trembling hands. The gesture was so calm that several employees shifted uneasily in their seats. They had prepared themselves to witness an emotional confrontation. Instead, they were watching someone surrender her place with quiet dignity. A security supervisor stepped forward next, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "I have been instructed to escort you from the building." Naomi offered him the same warm smile she had given him every morning for years. "You are only doing your job, Daniel," she replied. "Please do not apologize for following instructions." Daniel lowered his eyes, unable to answer. Across the auditorium, whispers spread from row to row. Some administrators nodded approvingly, convinced that decisive leadership required difficult sacrifices. Others avoided looking toward Naomi altogether, sensing that something about the situation felt deeply wrong even if they could not explain why. Ethan remained behind the podium with his hands resting confidently along its polished edges. His expression revealed neither hesitation nor regret. To him, this moment represented discipline. Personal relationships could not interfere with professional decisions. At least that was what he believed. Naomi slowly removed the simple wedding band from her left hand and looked at it for several quiet seconds. The gold reflected the bright auditorium lights, reminding her of a promise made years earlier when ambition had not yet overshadowed humility. She carefully placed the ring on the podium in front of Ethan. No dramatic speech followed. No accusation. Only one gentle sentence spoken clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "A title can change how people see you, Ethan, but it should never change how you see people." Her words floated through the silent hall like a question no one wanted to answer. Ethan glanced briefly at the ring before pushing it aside with the edge of a presentation folder, unwilling to let emotion interrupt the meeting. "This discussion is over," he said firmly. "Please leave the premises." Naomi nodded once. She turned away from the stage and began walking toward the main exit with slow, steady steps. As she passed through the center aisle, she noticed familiar faces everywhere. A pediatric nurse whose daughter she had secretly helped through college. A maintenance worker whose wife had received treatment after Naomi quietly approved financial assistance without requesting recognition. A young physician she had encouraged after his first difficult year of residency. Their eyes met hers only for a moment before most looked away, trapped between gratitude and fear. Not one voice interrupted the silence. Near the front row, Arthur Bennett remained seated with the leather folder resting on his knees. His fingers tightened around its worn edges until his knuckles turned pale. He had spent decades protecting the values upon which the hospital had been built, yet he understood that timing mattered as much as truth. He watched Naomi disappear through the auditorium doors without once looking back. The doors closed softly behind her, but the sound echoed through the room with surprising weight. It felt less like the departure of an employee and more like the closing chapter of a story that everyone believed had already ended. Only Arthur knew that the real story had not even begun, and inside the folder resting quietly in his hands lay the documents that would soon force every person in that auditorium to confront the cost of mistaking humility for insignificance. The conference hall remained frozen after the doors closed behind Naomi, yet Ethan Castellano did not allow the silence to linger for long. He straightened the microphone, glanced across the audience, and resumed speaking as though the interruption had merely been another routine personnel matter. "Now," he said with measured confidence, "let us return to the future of this institution." A few executives immediately began applauding again, eager to reinforce their loyalty. Others followed more cautiously, their hands meeting without conviction. Large presentation screens illuminated the room with architectural renderings of a new cardiac research wing, projected financial growth, and ambitious expansion plans stretching years into the future. Ethan spoke with certainty about innovation, efficiency, and market leadership. Every chart pointed upward. Every forecast promised remarkable success. Yet beneath the polished presentation, something invisible had shifted. Nurses who had admired his confidence only minutes earlier found themselves struggling to focus on the numbers before them. One young physician quietly replayed Naomi's final sentence in his mind. A maintenance supervisor stared toward the closed auditorium doors instead of the glowing screen. Even Daniel, the security supervisor, remained near the entrance longer than necessary, unable to shake the feeling that he had escorted the wrong person out of the building. Ethan noticed none of it. Encouraged by the smooth flow of his presentation, he announced another restructuring plan that would centralize decision-making within the executive office. Several department heads nodded enthusiastically. They had learned that agreement was rewarded more often than honest disagreement. As the final slide faded from the screen, Ethan reached for a folder containing the official termination documents, prepared to sign the last page that would permanently remove Naomi from the hospital records. Before the pen touched the paper, the sound of the auditorium doors opening echoed across the marble floor. Every head turned at once. Four attorneys dressed in dark business suits entered with calm, deliberate steps. Behind them walked Arthur Bennett carrying the same worn leather folder he had refused to release all morning. His expression was neither angry nor triumphant. It carried the quiet weight of a man fulfilling a responsibility he had hoped would never become necessary. The lead attorney approached the front of the room and spoke with respectful composure. "Mr. Castellano, we respectfully request that you postpone any further administrative action until several ownership documents are entered into today's official meeting record." Confusion spread instantly across the audience. Ethan frowned. "This meeting concerns executive operations," he replied. "Ownership matters have already been settled." The attorney offered a courteous smile. "With respect, sir, that assumption is precisely why we are here." Arthur slowly stepped beside the podium and placed the weathered leather folder on its polished surface. The room became so quiet that the gentle click of the folder's brass clasp sounded far louder than it should have. Some board members leaned forward. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The hospital's legal counsel, who had remained silent throughout the morning, suddenly lowered his eyes as though he already recognized the documents waiting inside. Ethan looked from Arthur to the attorneys, his confidence beginning to harden into impatience. "What exactly is this about?" he asked. Arthur rested one hand upon the folder before answering in an even voice that carried effortlessly through the silent hall. "For many years," he said, "I made a promise to a remarkable man that his final wishes would be honored at exactly the right moment, not the easiest one." No one moved. No one interrupted. The chandeliers reflected softly across the polished wood as Arthur opened the folder with extraordinary care, revealing a collection of original legal documents preserved with meticulous attention. At that instant, the atmosphere inside the auditorium changed completely. The meeting was no longer about leadership, budgets, or executive authority. Without a single raised voice, everyone could feel that the foundation beneath everything they believed about the hospital was beginning to shift, and Ethan was about to discover that some signatures carried far greater authority than the title printed on his office door. Arthur Bennett carefully lifted the first document from the leather folder as though it carried far more than ink upon paper. The room remained perfectly still. Even the quiet hum of the projector seemed to disappear beneath the weight of anticipation. The lead attorney accepted the document and addressed the audience with calm professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen, these are the original ownership records, amended trust agreements, and succession documents that have governed St. Gabriel Medical Center for more than 20 years. Ethan Castellano folded his arms. "I have already reviewed every ownership document required for my appointment as Chief Executive Officer," he replied confidently. Then, the attorney answered with a respectful nod, "You reviewed the executive management agreement, but not the private family trust that controls 100% of the hospital's voting ownership." A wave of confusion swept across the board members. Several immediately opened the binders in front of them, searching for information that simply was not there. Arthur quietly removed a second document bearing the embossed seal of the original trust. "This hospital was never intended to belong to investors," he said. "It was built to protect patients, families, and the people who serve them." His voice never rose, yet every word settled heavily across the room. The attorney continued reading. "Following the passing of founder Dr. Benjamin Carter, ownership transferred according to the Carter Family Preservation Trust. The sole beneficiary, effective upon reaching the specified legal conditions, is..." He paused only long enough for every eye in the auditorium to lift toward him. "Ms. Naomi Carter." Silence. Absolute silence. No applause. No whispers. Only the sound of someone quietly dropping a pen onto the polished floor. Ethan blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood. "That is impossible," he said. "Naomi worked here as a housekeeper." Arthur slowly turned toward him. She chose to work wherever people needed kindness the most. Ownership never required her to sit behind an executive desk. The attorney laid additional documents across the podium. Each carried official signatures, notarized certifications, and decades of legal history. Mrs. Carter has remained the sole owner of this institution throughout your entire tenure as Chief Executive Officer. Your authority has always existed under an employment agreement granted by the owner through the governing trust. Several board members stared at Ethan before looking back toward the empty doorway where Naomi had disappeared only minutes earlier. The realization spread across their faces one by one. Every executive meeting she had quietly attended. Every suggestion she had gently offered. Every hallway she had walked without demanding recognition. None of it had been accidental. She had never been pretending to belong there. She had belonged there more completely than anyone else in the building. Daniel, still standing near the entrance, slowly lowered his head as the memory of escorting her toward the exit replayed in painful clarity. The Human Resources Director glanced at the termination envelope still resting on the podium and felt her hands begin to tremble. Ethan looked toward the wedding band Naomi had quietly placed beside him earlier. It remained exactly where she had left it, catching the light beneath the crystal chandeliers. For the first time that morning, confidence disappeared from his expression. Not because he feared losing his position, but because every decision he had defended only moments before suddenly appeared through an entirely different lens. Arthur gently closed the folder after the final page had been displayed. "Power is often mistaken for ownership," he said softly. "But stewardship belongs only to those who remember why something was built in the first place." No one answered. Across the auditorium, hundreds of employees remained frozen in their seats, realizing that the woman they had watched leave without protest had never lost her place inside the hospital. They had simply failed to recognize the quiet strength of the person who had been protecting it all along. No one rushed toward the exit after the revelation because no one knew how to move beneath the weight of what had just happened. The confidence that had filled the executive conference hall only minutes earlier dissolved into uneasy silence. Board members stared at the ownership documents spread across the podium as though reading them a second time might somehow change the truth. It did not. Every signature, every certification, every carefully preserved page confirmed the same undeniable reality. Naomi Carter had never been standing on the lowest rung of the organization. She had quietly carried the highest responsibility without ever demanding the privileges that came with it. Ethan Castellano remained motionless beside the podium. The presentation he had prepared no longer mattered. The financial projections glowing faintly on the screen behind him suddenly appeared insignificant compared to the lesson unfolding in front of hundreds of employees. He looked toward the empty chair where Naomi had briefly stood before walking away with calm dignity. For the first time since becoming Chief Executive Officer, he struggled to find words that sounded certain. Around the room, memories began resurfacing with uncomfortable clarity. The pediatric nurse remembered the scholarship that had unexpectedly covered her daughter's tuition after she had nearly resigned because she could not afford both college and medical bills. The maintenance supervisor recalled receiving brand new equipment after casually mentioning safety concerns to Naomi during an early morning shift. A young physician remembered the handwritten note left anonymously on his desk after he questioned whether he belonged in medicine. One by one, people realized that the quiet kindness they had taken for granted had never been random. It had been leadership expressed without titles, applause, or recognition. Daniel slowly removed the visitor access card he had prepared for Naomi's departure and held it in his hands, unable to look at it without feeling ashamed. The Human Resources Director carefully folded the unsigned termination papers before placing them back into the envelope. She understood that the documents had become a record not of Naomi's dismissal but of the organization's moral failure. Several department heads who had applauded only moments earlier now sat with lowered eyes, replaying their own reactions and wondering why it had felt so easy to join the crowd instead of questioning what they had witnessed. Arthur Bennett quietly observed every face in the room. He had seen hospitals survive economic crises, natural disasters, and difficult years of change, but he also knew that character was tested most clearly during ordinary moments when people chose either courage or convenience. The documents explain who owns the hospital, he said gently, breaking the silence, but they do not answer a more important question. Every eye turned toward him. When someone was treated without dignity this morning, how many of us believed it was wrong, and how many of us remained silent because speaking carried a personal cost? No one answered. The question lingered in the room far longer than any speech could have. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the simple wedding band still resting beside the folder. It no longer looked like a forgotten piece of jewelry. It looked like a quiet reminder of promises neglected in the pursuit of admiration and success. Outside the conference hall, Naomi continued walking through the familiar corridors with the same unhurried pace she had always carried. Patients smiled as she passed, unaware of what had happened upstairs. She paused to help an elderly visitor find the oncology department before continuing toward the front entrance. Even after everything she had endured that morning, her first instinct remained helping someone else. And inside the conference hall, that single unseen act of kindness began weighing more heavily on every heart than all the authority, prestige, and applause that had filled the room only a few minutes before. By early afternoon the conference hall had emptied, yet no one returned to work with the confidence they had carried into the meeting. Conversations that usually revolved around schedules, budgets, and patient volumes had been replaced by quiet reflection. Every hallway seemed unusually still, as though the building itself had absorbed the lesson unfolding within its walls. In a small boardroom overlooking the hospital garden, Arthur Bennett and the legal team waited patiently beside the original trust documents. No one spoke unnecessarily. They all understood that the next decision belonged to only one person. Nearly 30 minutes later, the door opened softly. Naomi Carter stepped inside wearing the same Navy housekeeping uniform she had worn that morning. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or authority. She carried no entourage, no prepared speech, and no trace of resentment. She simply greeted everyone with the same calm warmth they had always known. Arthur rose from his chair. "The board is prepared to restore every position and authority that has always been yours," he said respectfully. Naomi thanked him before looking toward the large windows where patients could be seen walking slowly through the healing garden below. "Before we discuss positions," she answered, "I would rather discuss people." Moments later the board members gathered once again, this time without cameras or applause. The atmosphere felt entirely different. Ethan Castellano entered quietly and took the only empty chair without asking for the head of the table. For the first time since anyone could remember, he listened before speaking. Naomi remained standing rather than taking the owner's seat prepared for her. She looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes with steady compassion instead of judgment. "This hospital has never belonged to me alone," she began. "It belongs to every family searching for hope, every nurse finishing an overnight shift, every physician carrying the weight of difficult decisions, and every employee who remembers that kindness is part of healing." No one interrupted. She continued in the same gentle voice. "Today was painful, but not because I lost a job. It was painful because too many good people believed they had to remain silent when someone was treated without dignity." Several department directors lowered their heads. Daniel quietly wiped moisture from his eyes. The human resources director folded her hands together, unable to escape the memory of accepting Naomi's identification badge only hours earlier. Naomi looked around the table one final time before making her decision. "I will not remove people because they made one mistake under pressure," she said. "Character is revealed by what we choose after recognizing our mistakes." Relief spread across several faces before she calmly continued. "However, leadership is different. Those entrusted with authority must protect dignity before protecting reputation. Anyone who knowingly encouraged humiliation instead of respect will no longer serve in executive leadership." The decision was firm, yet completely free of anger. There was no celebration, no revenge, only accountability balanced with mercy. Finally, Naomi turned toward Ethan. Their eyes met in complete silence. She did not raise her voice or demand an apology. "The board will decide your executive role according to the trust agreement," she said softly. "As for everything else, that is a conversation about character, not contracts." Ethan slowly nodded, unable to defend the choices that had brought them to this moment. The room remained silent once again, but this silence no longer carried fear. It carried understanding. For the first time that day, everyone present realized that true authority had never entered the room with expensive suits, executive titles, or public applause. It had quietly walked back inside wearing a simple housekeeping uniform, carrying nothing except humility, wisdom, and the courage to choose mercy when revenge would have been far easier. 1 month later, the atmosphere inside St. Gabriel Medical Center felt unmistakably different, not because the marble floors shined more brightly or the walls displayed new awards, but because the people walking those hallways carried themselves with a quieter sense of purpose. Every morning began the same way it always had, with patients arriving through the front entrance carrying hope, uncertainty, and faith that someone inside would care enough to help them. The difference now was found in the small moments that rarely appeared in annual reports. Department directors spent more time visiting patient floors than executive conference rooms. Nurses felt comfortable speaking honestly when supplies needed improvement. Housekeeping staff were greeted by name instead of being hurried past without acknowledgement. Physicians paused to thank technicians after long procedures. Respect had slowly become part of the daily routine rather than an inspirational slogan framed upon a wall. Naomi Carter continued arriving before 7 o'clock every morning in the same dependable sedan she had driven for years. She still wore simple clothing when walking through the hospital before changing into professional attire only when legal or board responsibilities required it. Most mornings she preferred carrying a clipboard instead of standing behind a podium. She still visited the pediatric wing first. She still remembered birthdays, family milestones, and the names of volunteers who quietly served behind the scenes. New employees often assumed she was simply another experienced staff member until they attended their first board meeting and discovered who she truly was. The surprise on their faces always made Naomi smile, not because she enjoyed secrecy, but because it reminded everyone that character could never be measured by appearances alone. Ethan Castellano remained at the hospital in a greatly reduced advisory capacity during the leadership transition approved by the board. He accepted the decision without protest. The office that had once symbolized prestige no longer mattered as much as the opportunity to rebuild trust one conversation at a time. Some afternoons he walked through the same patient corridors Naomi had encouraged him to visit months earlier. For the first time, he stopped long enough to listen instead of simply observing. He thanked nurses for difficult overnight shifts. He spoke with families waiting for encouraging news. He even joined the housekeeping team one evening to better understand the work he had rarely noticed before. No newspaper reported those quiet moments, yet they became the most meaningful lessons of his career. Arthur Bennett officially retired later that season. Before leaving, he placed the old leather folder into the hospital archives beside the original blueprints drawn decades earlier by Dr. Benjamin Carter. As he closed the archive cabinet, he smiled softly, knowing the hospital had finally returned to the values upon which it had been founded. On his final walk through the main lobby, he paused beside a large window overlooking the entrance. Naomi happened to be helping an elderly visitor complete admission paperwork while a young volunteer patiently carried the woman's overnight bag. Neither of them noticed Arthur watching from across the room. They were too focused on serving someone else. Around them, doctors, nurses, administrators, and support staff moved naturally through the lobby until, almost without thinking, each person who recognized Naomi slowed for a brief moment. Some smiled warmly. Others offered a respectful greeting. Several simply nodded with quiet appreciation before continuing their work. None of them had been instructed to do so. Respect had become a choice instead of an obligation. As the morning sunlight streamed through the glass entrance and filled the lobby with a gentle golden glow, the hospital no longer stood as a monument to power or prestige. It stood as living proof that the strongest foundation any institution could ever possess was not wealth, influence, or authority, but the simple courage to protect another person's dignity even when no one else was watching. And that day, everyone remembered what true dignity looked like.